Welcome to War Tech Talk, Eastern Circle's podcast on military technology innovation, its battlefield application in Ukraine, and geopolitical impact. I'm Anastasiya Shapochkina, president of Eastern Circle's think tank in Paris. And I'm joined on this episode by Eastern Circle's analysts Daryna-Maryna Patiuk and Bohdan Kostiuk. Hello, guys.
Nice to see you here again.
Thank you for having us.
In today's episode, we'll discuss the Russian drone attack on Poland on September 10th, what it tells us about European defense capabilities to face the Russian threat, and about NATO cooperation going forward. We'll also touch on a broader issue, the cost of the NATO response to the attack, the US pullback from Europe, and Russia's evolving strategy.
On September 10th, Russia launched up to 19 Russian drones into Polish airspace, according to the Polish government statement.
Wait, does not that sound familiar? September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland from the western flank, and the Soviets invade from the eastern border 2 weeks later. Déjà vu?
Well, NATO and Polish authorities are being careful about the definitions. They have refrained from drawing historical parallels or dramatizing the situation. NATO forces downed at Russia Herberra drones with missiles launched from two F-35s, two F-16s, as well as Mi-24, Mi-17 and Black Hawk helicopters.
What drones did Russians use?
So it's actually were Herberra drones. They look like Shahed, but they are much cheaper. And while Shahed's main purpose is destruction of infrastructure or residential areas, Herberras are meant to detect, distract, and overwhelm air defense systems. There are three types of Herberras. The first one, surveillance drones. The second ones, decoy UAVs. And the third are those carrying 5 kilos payload for attacks.
So September 10th also marks the first very time Russian drones have been intercepted over NATO territory.
And that's a turning point. Let's start with a deep dive. What happened?
So on September 10th, Russia carried out a coordinated air attack on Poland with estimated 19 drones, which entered the Polish airspace from Belarus and Ukraine. They flew 250 to 300 kilometers deep in Poland.
I've read the official Russian response, where they claim they had no intentions of striking targets in Poland. What's your take on this?
Well, Defense Express, a magazine on defense, writes that Russia had been preparing this attack since July, using Polish SIM cards as a part of the drone's navigation and controlling systems. Polish SIM cards allowed Russia to control the drones while they were flying over NATO territory. This would be impossible with Ukrainian SIM cards, which are used in Russian drones flying over Ukraine. In response, several Polish airports had to shut down for several hours, including Rzeszów Airport, which is the gate for the Western officials and the military aid heading to Ukraine.
So, if, as you suggest, it was a deliberate action, what do you see as the purpose of this attack?
Well, it may have been a test of Poland's defense systems and decision-making chain. From the top levels of the government and the Ministry of National Defense down to the pilots and anti-aircraft units, the entire response system was likely being observed and evaluated.
How does the cost of NATO response compare to the cost of Russian attack?
So, to give you some numbers, the intercepting missile AIM-120 that was used to target Herberra cost over $1 million. The cost to build a single Herberra drone varies between $10,000 and $30,000. So what does all this tell to us? Russia is trying to force NATO into spending millions defending against drones that cost thousands. It is an asymmetric strategy, and it's escalating.
In reaction to the event, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, stated, "Ukraine is ready to help Poland build an effective system of warning and protection against such Russian threats. What I'm curious about is how can Ukraine be the helper of Poland? Ukraine doesn't possess any kind of indigenous air defense system and uses the air defense capabilities provided by the West. Now, the situation with Poland can create a competition in the EU for the air defense systems. We posed this question to the expert of Ukrainian Prism, Serhii Herasymchuk.
As I told you, there are both negative and positive sides of it, and everything depends on the way chosen by the NATO and the EU. Because now we have this crossroad point. So if everything goes in a positive scenario, then indeed we will talk more about possibility of joint efforts of Ukraine and the West, how to fix the situation with the Ukrainian sky. And here, both Ukraine and our Western partners have something to propose, and we both can be contributors because, on the one hand, indeed, Ukraine depends on Western weapons and Western financing, but on the other hand, the Ukrainian armed forces have more skills, are better trained. Plus, well, because of the fact that Ukraine faces attacks almost every day, there already know how to shoot down drones by cheaper means. Because if you have to use Dutch F-35 each time Gerbera enters your airspace, it's going to be sort of expensive. Perhaps the Netherlands can afford it for a while, but I don't think that's a feasible option for, let's say, Lithuania, Romania, or even Poland. And in this regard, the Ukrainian experience can be very useful for these neighboring countries who can learn from Ukraine how to make it cheaper to shoot down Russian drones, how to recognize what is Shahid and what is Gerbera, and so on and so forth, because there is no need to spend more. But of course, there can be negative consequences as well, and you've mentioned some of them. Ukraine depends heavily on the Western patriots, American patriots, but which not necessarily are stationed in the United States, but rather in some European countries. We strongly benefited from Romanian decision to pass their patriots to Ukraine. And definitely, if public opinion thinks that now Romania, Slovakia, Poland are threatened by Russian drones and missiles, then the desire to pass to Ukraine the patriots would be lesser and lesser, which is a challenge.
What about Polish perception of Russian intentions? How does Poland see it? As a provocation? A test? A warning? To help us unpack it all, we've invited a special guest, Romain Le Quiniou, Managing Director of Créative, a French think tank working on Central and Eastern Europe.
I think it's pretty clear what Polish authorities and the vast majority of the population perceived, that it was not an accident that Russian drones didn't fly towards the territory of Poland and of the European Union and of NATO by pure coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's something that has been planned by Russia, that has been planned by the Russian army to test Poland, to test NATO alliance, to test the European Union also to some extent. So yeah, I think that there is no naivety, when it comes to the intentions of the Russians by sending more or less dozens of drones towards the territory of Poland. It was deliberate, and yes, it was a test. Why a test? We know that the Russians have, this tendency to test our forces. They've been doing that for decades. So this is not new. That is the reaction, how long Europeans, NATO forces take to shoot down a drone. This is exactly what they wanted to have as an information. Are the NATO countries being able to cooperate fluently? Are they able to tackle the threats? All of them, not all of them. In which time? Was the communication towards the Polish population by the government enough, not enough? Do people are following the advices or not? So there is a multiplicity of objectives for Russia, and this, I think that Poland, as well as most of the European countries, understood quite well. Now, the reaction of the Polish authorities, well, it looks like from the outside and from the first reports that, military speaking, the reaction was good from the Polish armed forces as well as the NATO armed forces, meaning that the threats have been neutralized, or the most imminent one. The population has been warned professionally, calmly, seriously. So, there was this bulletin of alert. People were advised to stay home. They were informed of the situation in real time. The politicians took their responsibilities, had some urgency meetings. They had also some public intervention. So I think all in all, it was quite well, and the test has been a success for Poland, a success for NATO. But of course, this is something that is, a big step forward from Russia, and we need to take it very seriously. And do we take it seriously collectively? I don't know. In Poland, for sure, but in the rest of the alliance, I really do hope that people understand that Russia is doing more and more with this kind of attack, even if we don't characterize it officially like an attack. For political and strategic reasons, but they do that more and more because we are not serious enough in European security at the moment.
This raises the question about the state of European defense, whether it's ready or not to respond to the Russian threat. Here is the political vision of the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on the day of the attack.
We need to invest more in our defense, ramp up defense production, so we have what we need to deter and defend. And we need to continue to support Ukraine, whose security is interlinked with our own.
However, the two strategic goals outlined by NATO and echoed by the European Commission, investing into European defense on the one hand and supporting Ukraine on the other, are often perceived as contradictory by the European defense industry. Here is Romain Le Quiniou again.
Well, we have to see. For the moment, it's... we cannot really decide on this. Ukrainians are producing because they understood that, what they get from the West, what they get from the US, what they get from the Europeans is not sure. We're coming back to the discussion of security guarantees. That, yes, of course, on paper you have cooperation, on paper you have security, on paper people gave you, but you cannot control the political developments, you cannot control the decisions in countries which are not yours. So the most important thing for them was, after benefiting from deliveries from partners, was to make sure that they can control as much as possible their own production of drones, of missiles, of counter missiles, of everything. Who cares? Everything they need, the objective of Ukrainians, and it's a strategic and national security objective, is to produce as much as possible those things to ensure their own production and to ensure their own protection. It will continue like this, so that's for sure. The war is not going to stop tomorrow, even if there might be a potential hypothetical ceasefire or something like this. Ukraine will still be in danger. So Ukraine will continue to produce. This will not cease. So we have to understand that in Europe, we have to understand how to transform the potential, competition from Ukrainians when it comes to defense industry into cooperation. What we struggle still to do in Europe is to understand our needs and to understand who is able on each need to produce faster, cheaper, and in the more qualitative way. And this is exactly what we should do. We should understand that at the moment we don't have enough money to be fully secure in the context of massification as well as technology. So what we need to do is to identify the best potential companies, countries, production line for each tools we need, for each product, military project we need, and to assume the fact that it might kill a few businesses, it might put in danger a few companies, but at the same time, where you are losing, you are winning somewhere else. And we need to face this, because at the moment I think we don't choose this option to be collaborative, because we think that we can still save some business interest, political interest. But if tomorrow people understand that it's either we cooperate or we put ourselves in danger, maybe things will change. And I think that we need finally to understand that we have some money to produce. Let's maximize the effect on this, and let's be sure that this money is used rightly and to protect ourselves. Because at the end, this is the money of the citizens, and the citizens, rightly so, are asking to use this money rightly and the most transparently possible.
Russia is sending three messages to the West. First is that Russian army is advancing, slowly but surely, and Ukraine is slated to lose. Second, therefore, Europe should stop throwing good money after bad in a losing battle, especially in the context of high budget deficits. Third, if Europe does not stop, it will be next. And Russia prepares its military exercise Zapad, which is translated as the West, and mirrors a military exercise between Russia and Belarus by the similar name in the fall of 2021, which directly preceded the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It remains to be seen if Europe will hide Russia's warning, accept disgrace to avoid war, prepare to fight, or try to de-escalate the situation, which Russia hopes Europe will do at the cost of Ukrainian land and people.
Do you think that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, sending signals only to Europe, but maybe also to Ukraine or the United States of America?
Ukraine is grown accustomed to Russian war mongering, to actually being at war with Russia, and Ukrainian mood and social mood and also military mood depends more on the actual military effort of Russia and also on the duration of the full-scale war, which of course by the end of the fourth year has become extremely stringent on the morale of the civilian population and has exhausted Ukrainian human resources capacity to fight. That much more than any rhetoric by Vladimir Putin is guiding Ukrainian perception of the war. Now, concerning the United States, it is now a total U-turn of the foreign policy development of the global governance.
For example, the lifting sanctions from Belarus.
We have seen, so many steps the U.S. has or has not taken from not imposing any new sanctions on Russia, together with the European Union, something that the EU has done several times since Trump became president. And the U.S. has never matched and never stood next and behind the European Union with its own sanctions, which the US sanctions have always been considered more impactful. Second, the US reversed its own foreign policy position by its vote in the General Assembly of NATO in February 2025, at the third anniversary of the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when it voted no to the definition of the invasion as an invasion, together with Russia, together with China and North Korea. That is a total U-turn from a traditional U.S. foreign policy stand on this issue to the weakening of sanctions on Russian oligarchs, on Russian and Belarusian recently companies which are fully involved in an integral part of the Russian military-industrial complex, to very warm diplomatic relations with Russia, accentuated by the latest invitation of Putin, who'd been condemned by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and war crimes. The US has welcomed Putin on the US soil, being one of the founding nations of the ICC. All of these and many other steps to us today signal that the US stopped truly being the part of the West in the foreign policy perspective. And any signal in Russia may send is no longer targeting Washington, because Washington is behaving more like a Russian ally than as an adversary.
Yeah, but from the other point of view, the Americans now, they're pressing EU to impose like secondary sanctions on China and India for buying Russian oil.
India, in fact, faced a drastic hike of the U.S. trade tariffs, right, up to 50% and now of a tariff on Indian imports to the U.S., supposedly because of Indian imports of Russian oil. Well, everybody knows, and the U.S. has enough competence in its Department of Commerce to understand that it's not like India has drastically increased its imports of Russian oil since 2022, or started consuming much more oil. Actually, it is just a transition hub to then reroute the oil to Europe, especially based on the quotas which the US and Europe imposed together. So India, from its own perspective and from the legal perspective, is totally in sync with the rules set up by the US itself and has been singled out. Unlike China, by the way, but has been singled out alone as for what The Economist named kind of a unusual punishment. So India is a case in point. China is far from facing the same fate because of its extraordinary importance as a trade partner for the US and its total lack of hesitation to use any levers against the US in negotiations.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think what we all overlooking or trying to overlook is actually the Chinese perspective on this, because it's like the Russian attacks, the first time they were directed into the NATO member state, plus the Russians also attacked the building of the government of Ukraine recently. And I feel like every time Vladimir Putin goes to China, he returned like emboldened to do something extremely escalatory. What do you think about this?
I think that the recent trip to China upon the occasion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting organized by Xi Jinping was for Russia just one of numerous bilateral visits and bilateral meetings between China and Xi, and then multilateral visits within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What was different about it this time is China's positioning within the global system of governance. SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, since its creation in the early 2000s, has always been looked upon as, a toothless organization. Nobody knows why it's there. Never was able to position itself as a security actor, etc., etc. This time, this year's meeting, featuring among visitors, India, a strategic rival of China, and Slovakia, a member of both NATO and the European Union, right? Yeah. Turkey, which is now a part of SCO, have signaled the changing tide. It signals that there is a response to the vacuum which has emerged in the international system of governance, the vacuum left by the United States' decision to withdraw from international geopolitics. And that vacuum China is ready to fill. And that's something that has been signaled. And one of the ways for China to fill that vacuum is to use Russia as a projection of its own influence. Because without China's economic support of Russia and military support of Russia,
and political
and political and diplomatic support, Russia would never be able to last so long in a war of attrition. Over the last 3 years, Poland has emerged as a new defense industry actor on European landscape. We will analyze Polish foreign, defense policy and industry in our upcoming episode. This episode of War Tech Talk was prepared by Daryna-Maryna Patiuk and Bohdan Kostiuk. It was edited by me, Anastasiya Shapochkina. Production by Elisa Gadeva.